I have read for the human seat in that chamber for 31 years, and in all that time no Bloomwarden ever once looked at me long enough to learn my name. They looked at the words I carried for them. They never looked at the mouth. I tell you this first because it explains everything that followed. The conclave did not see hands. It saw functions. And a thing you have decided is only a function is a thing you believe you can replace. The High Conclave of Bloomwardens met in the vaulted Bloom on Osciate, under a dome of grown glass the color of a shallow sea, and the light that came down through it was always the light of a late afternoon that never ended, soft and gold and certain of itself. The wardens sat in tiers that rose in a full ring, hundreds of them, their tall pale bodies wrapped in the layered ceremonial silk that marked Bloom rank, and from the crown of each warden rose the sensory frond, a fan of fine pale filaments that opened when they were pleased and drew tight and dark when they were not. When a thing delighted the conclave, the whole ring of fronds opened at once, and the chamber filled with a slow rustle like wind in dry grass. I learned to read that sound before I learned to read their script. We sat low. That was the architecture of it, and the architecture was the argument. The human delegation was given a bench on the chamber floor, below the lowest tier, in the well where petitioners and servants and the keepers of small things were placed, so that the wardens could look down on them in the literal and only sense that mattered to the conclave. We were the carriers. To the Bloomwardens, the carriers belonged in the well. I should tell you what the carrying was, because the wardens never understood it, and that misunderstanding is the whole of this account. The Osciate conquered held 900 worlds, and not one of them had been born ready for life. They were tended worlds made, slowly, over centuries, out of dead rock and thin air, and kept alive afterward by a labor that never ended for a single day. A living world is not a monument you raise and walk away from. It is a fire you feed. The soils need their microbial mats renewed, strain by strain, before they sour. The pollinators of 1,000 engineered crops must be moved between worlds in their season, because no single world holds a stable enough store of them. Breeding stock thins and must be crossed with stock from another world to keep it from collapse. Spores, seed banks, the small living ballast of a biosphere, all of it has to be carried, world to world, lane to lane, in the right hands at the right hour forever. That carrying was the work of human beings. It had been ours for 9 generations, since the conquered first found us and decided we were good for it. Thousands of small human ships moved along the lanes, slow and patient, a quiet, endless circulation through the body of the conquered, and the worlds bloomed because we kept them blooming. We were the thing that moved the living dust from flower to flower across the whole vast garden of settled space. We were, if you want the word the wardens themselves would later be forced to learn, the pollinators of the conquered. And like pollinators everywhere, we were beneath notice until we were gone. The wardens did not carry. The wardens blessed. Their office was to stand over a world at its festival and open their fronds and pronounce it tended, to take into the record the bloom that other hands had made, and to wear the credit of it on their silk. They believed, I think, that the worlds bloomed because they blessed them. They had told themselves that story for so long that it had become the only story they could hear. So when High Warden Selasin rose, on the day I am telling you about, and proposed that the human franchise be retired, he proposed it as a kindness. I remember the exact light. The gold came down through the grown glass and pooled on the white stone of the floor, and it pooled, as it always did by the geometry of the dome, on us, on our low bench, so that the one bright place in that whole vast chamber was the place where the carriers sat, and the wardens above us were in the cooler shade of their tiers. None of them had ever remarked on it. They did not think of us as standing in the light. They thought of us as standing in the bottom of a well. Senior Carrier Harlan Rays led our delegation. He was past 70 then, a broad, slow, weathered man who had spent 50 years on the lanes before they gave him the seat, and he had the stillness that comes to people who have done one hard thing for a very long time and stopped needing to be told they are good at it. He sat with his hands flat on his knees. He did not fidget. In 31 years I never once saw Harlan Ray's hurry. Beside him sat old Mara Quill, who had carried the deep lanes, the long hauls out to the rim worlds where a single mistake in the breeding stock could not be corrected for a decade, and who knew more about the living health of 900 worlds than any warden had ever bothered to learn. And there were 4 others, all of them carriers, all of them old. We did not send the young to the Conclave. The young were needed on the lanes. High Warden SciFiStory stood at the speaking rail, and his frond opened wide, pale and pleased, and I began to read his words into the human ear line, lo, the way I always did. He spoke of mercy. He spoke of the long centuries the human hands had labored in the service of the conquered, of the dignity of toil, of the gratitude the wardens felt, and here the fronds rustled their soft agreement for the patient work of the lesser hands. And then he came to the gift. The conquered, he said, had grown wise enough and rich enough to relieve humanity of its burden. The House of Velt had perfected a fleet of tending drones, automatic, tireless, that would carry the living stock along the lanes without the frailty and the slowness and the short lives of human crews. The work would pass to the drones, and to the Orsk, the eager client species who had petitioned long for a place of greater service, and the human hands would at last be set down. Humanity would be relieved, honored and relieved and retired. He said all of this the way you would announce that you had decided to free a faithful animal from its labor. He believed he was being generous. That is the part I have never been able to make anyone outside that chamber understand. He was not cruel. Cruelty would have required him to see us. He simply did not, and so he handed our life's work away as though it were a yoke we would be grateful to have lifted, and his frond stayed open the whole time, pleased with the warmth of its own charity. I read it into the human line, word for word, flat, the way I had trained myself. An interpreter does not editorialize, but I felt Mara Quill go very still beside me, and I felt the temperature of our bench change. The way a room changes before weather. The drones could carry. That was true. A drone can lift a sealed container of breeding stock from one world and set it down on another, and the manifest will say the work is done. The Orsk could carry too. They were strong and willing and quick. But the carrying was never the lifting. That was the thing no warden in that ring had ever once understood, because not one of them had ever carried. The carrying was knowing which strain of mat a tired soil could take and which would burn it. It was reading a world's hunger from the color of its shallows and the smell of its rain and deciding, against the manifest, that this season it needed the rim stock and not the inner stock, because the inner stock had grown too narrow, and the world was about to crash, and no document anywhere said so yet. It was timing, the brutal, unforgiving timing of living things. Knowing that a pollinator brood moved 3 days late was a pollinator brood that arrived to a bloom already failed. It was 9 generations of judgment that lived in the hands and the noses and the long memories of old carriers like Mara Quill, judgment that had never been written down because the wardens had never asked for it, had never wanted it, had filed the carriers in the well and the carrying under menial and looked away. You cannot give a drone a thing you have never noticed exists. You cannot hand to an eager client species a craft you have spent 300 years refusing to learn the shape of. But the Conclave did not know that, because to know it, they would have had to look down into the well and see something other than a function. The vote was called. It is a slow thing, a conclave vote, a ripple of opening fronds rising tier by tier around the ring, and I watched it open all the way around, pale fan after pale fan, the soft dry grass rustle swelling until it filled the dome. The mercy carried. It carried overwhelmingly. High Warden SciFiStory's frond opened to its fullest span, and he turned the warmth of it down toward our bench, toward Ray's, expecting, I am certain he was expecting, gratitude. A bow. Some sound of thanks, rising up out of the well to be received. Harlan Ray stood. He did not raise his voice. I had my line ready, my hand on the panel, prepared to carry whatever argument he made up into the warden's ears, and I want you to understand that I had heard Ray's argue, that he could be hard and exact when a world's life hung on it, that I expected a fight. The whole delegation expected a fight. Mara Quill had her jaw set for it. He gave no argument at all. "Then we'll stand down," he said. 4 words. I read them up into the chamber, 4 words, and the dome was so quiet by then that I think they heard the human voice under mine, the low gravel of it, even those who could not understand the sounds. He did not say it bitterly. He did not say it as a threat. He said it the way you confirm a thing that has been decided flat, plain, final. And then he gathered the long carrier's coat around himself and turned, and the 6 of them rose from the bench in the well and walked out of the vaulted bloom, up the long aisle of white stone, through the great doors, into the day. They did not look up at the tears. They did not look back. Mara Quill was the last through the doors, and she paused there for a moment, an old woman in the bright doorway with the gold light pouring in around her, and she looked back once, not in anger, I think, but the way you look back at a thing you do not expect to see again, and then she was gone too. I stayed. I was the interpreter. I belonged to the chamber, not to the delegation, and the conclave had not dismissed me. So I was there to see the fronds open wide again all around the ring, pleased, rustling, satisfied with the grace of what they had done. Seilassing received the moment as a benediction returned. They believed the humans had bowed and gone gratefully to their rest. They had watched 6 people walk out without a word, and they had read it as thanks, because the well had never been allowed to mean anything else. I sat in the bright pool of light at the bottom of that chamber, alone now on the empty bench, and I understood, before any warden in that ring understood it, that I had just watched the Osseate Concord vote to stop its own heart, and applaud while it did. The drones flew well. I will give the House of Velt that. In the first season after the retirement, the tending drones moved more tonnage along the lanes than the human fleet had moved in its best year, and the Orsk crews were tireless and proud, and the manifests came in full and clean, every container lifted, every delivery logged, every schedule met. The conclave was delighted. Seilassing's frond was open at every session that season. Efficiency, he told the ring, had at last replaced sentiment. The lesser hands had been relieved, and the worlds carried on, and see, the manifests are full. The manifests were full. The trouble was never in the manifests. The first world to fail was a small inner one called Thune, a quiet farming world far from anyone's attention, and it did not fail the way the wardens would have noticed a thing failing. There was no fire, no alarm. The drones delivered Thune its scheduled stock, on time, every container, exactly as the manifest required, the inner stock pollinators, the standard mat, the documented strains, all of it correct on paper. But Thune's soil that season was not a soil that wanted the documented strains. Mara Quill would have known it. Mara Quill, or one of her carriers, would have come down through Thune's atmosphere and smelled the rain and seen the wrong color creeping into the shallows and known, the way you know a sick child by the heat of their forehead, that this world needed the rim stock this year, the broader cross, and would have carried it the rim stock against the manifest and saved it. The drone carried what the manifest said. The drone could not smell the rain. Thune's mat soured. The pollinators, the wrong strain for that tired soil, did not take, and the bloom that should have come did not come, and the crops thinned. And by the end of the season, a world that had fed itself for 200 years was importing food and did not entirely know why. It was a small thing. One world. The conclave, if it noticed at all, filed it as local mismanagement. But it was not one world. It was the first of 900, and the same quiet death was moving along every lane at once, in slow motion, beneath the full and reassuring manifests. A breeding line on a rim world grown too narrow, with no carrier there to cross it in time, beginning the long collapse that would not show for 3 years and could not be reversed once it showed. A pollinator brood on a coastal world delivered 4 days past its window, on schedule, the manifest said. The schedule simply being wrong by 4 days that no document captured, arriving to a bloom already gone to rot. A microbial mat that the old carriers had quietly been rotating between three worlds in a pattern that existed nowhere but in their heads, now delivered to all three on the same standard cycle, all three souring together. None of it looked like catastrophe. That was the terrible patience of it. Each world failed alone, quietly on time, with full manifests, and the wardens above could look at any single failure and call it a local matter, an accident, a fault of that world's own keepers. It took 2 years before anyone in the vaulted bloom said the word that mattered, and the one who finally said it was not a warden. It was a clerk of the registry, reading the bloom records into the morning session, who stopped in the middle of his reading, because the number in front of him would not let him go on. The blooms were down across the Concord, not on one world, on 410. I was in the chamber that morning. I had stayed on as interpreter even with no delegation to interpret for, because the conclave still summoned the occasional human petitioner, some carrier's family seeking a ruling, and someone had to read for them. So I was there at the bottom of the well when the clerk read the number, and I watched the fronds around the ring do something I had never seen them do in 31 years. They drew tight, all of them. The whole ring of pale fans went dark and narrow at once, drawn in against the bodies of the wardens, and the chamber that had filled so often with the soft, pleased rustle of agreement filled instead with a sound I had no name for, because I had never heard the conclave afraid. It took them another half-year to do what they should have done in the first hour. They blamed the drones first, and recalled the House of Velt, and the House of Velt proved with full logs that every container had been lifted and delivered exactly as ordered, which was true, and which was precisely the problem, and which the wardens could not understand because they still did not understand what the carrying had been. They blamed the Orsk, and the Orsk wept in the chamber and swore they had carried everything they were given, which was also true. They commissioned studies. They blessed the failing worlds harder, opened their fronds over the dying soils at festival after festival, and the soils did not care, because the soils had never bloomed from blessing. And one by one, the worlds that had passed the point of saving stopped being matters of study and became matters of mourning. Thune was the first the conclave formally recorded as lost, not lost as in destroyed, but lost as in no longer able to keep itself alive. Its people evacuated inward to crowd on two worlds that were themselves beginning to thin. Then two rim worlds whose breeding lines had collapsed past recovery. Then a whole coastal cluster. The number of lost worlds was small against 900. But every carrier who had ever flown the lanes could read the curve of it, and the curve did not bend back on its own. It was old SciFiStory himself who finally rose and proposed that the human hands be recalled. He did not call it a mistake. Wardens do not have a word for their own mistake. Their whole office is built on the certainty of their blessing, and a bloomwarden who admits error admits that the worlds were never blooming from him. He called it a restoration of the ancient partnership. He called it a return to the dignity of toil. But the fronds that ringed the chamber stayed dark and tight while he said it, and everyone in the vaulted bloom understood, even if no warden would say it aloud, that the conclave was about to go down into the well it had spent 300 years looking down into, and ask. They summoned the human delegation back to Osseate, and after a silence that had lasted nearly 3 years, the carriers came. I read for them again that last day. They gave us the same bench in the same well in the same pool of late gold light. No warden had thought to change the architecture, and I do not think any of them even saw the irony of it, that the one bright place in the chamber was still the place where the carriers sat, and the wardens above were still in the cool shade of their tears, exactly as it had always been. Only now the bright place was the place that held the only thing that could save them. Harlan Rays was past 73 by then, slower, his hands not quite as steady on his knees, but the stillness in him had not changed at all. Mara Quill was beside him, older, harder, her eyes moving once around the ring of dark fronds and then settling level on SciFiStory. The 4 others, the same 6. The young were still needed on the lanes, for there were lanes still running. The lanes humanity had kept flying for its own worlds in the 3 years it had stood down. And those worlds, I will tell you, had bloomed every single season without fail, because the hands had never left them. Seilasin stood at the rail and his frond would not open. He tried. I watched the old warden try to summon the wide pale fan of his authority, and it would not come. It stayed drawn and narrow against his crown, and he spoke from beneath it. He spoke for a long time. He spoke of partnership and of dignity, and of the ancient bond between the wardens and the hands, and of the regrettable inefficiencies of the drone fleet, and of the conquered's wish to restore the carriers to their honored place. He did not say the worlds were dying. He could not make his mouth shape it in that chamber. But he came, at the very end, to the thing he had come to say, and he said it looking down into the well, down at Harlan Ray's, and his voice when it came was not the voice of a warden conferring a mercy. It was lower than that. It was nearly the voice of a man asking. "Resume the carrying," he said. "The conquered requires it." I read it down into the human line, and then I waited with my hand on the panel for whatever Harlan Ray's would say, and so did every warden in that ring, the whole dark-fronded mass of them leaning the smallest degree forward over their tiers, hundreds of them, waiting on 6 old people at the bottom of a well. Ray stood. It took him longer than it once had. He stood the way an old carrier stands, slow and certain, and he put his weight on his feet, and he looked up, for the first time in all those years. The human seat looked up level into the high tiers, and he gave them again almost nothing. "We didn't take it from you," he said. "You set it down." That was nearly all of it. I read it up into the chamber, and the silence after it was the deepest I ever heard in that dome. Seilasin's frond trembled and stayed dark. Ray's let the silence sit. He did not press it. He was not a man who pressed. And then he said the rest plainly. "The way you tell someone a hard truth you take no pleasure in telling, because the kindest thing you can do for a person standing in the wreckage is not to lie to them about the size of it. We'll carry again," he said. "Our crews are willing. The lanes are open." A pause. "But you should know what you're asking for, because no one in this room has ever known, and that is most of why you're standing in it now." He did not raise his voice for any of it. "The carrying was never the lifting," he said. "Your drones lift fine. The carrying was knowing what a world needs the season before the manifest does. It lives in the people who have spent their lives doing it, and it doesn't write down, and it doesn't transfer, and it took 9 generations to grow. You retired 9 generations of it in an afternoon, to relieve us of a burden we never asked to be relieved of. Some of what we knew is still flying. Some of it died on worlds you let go past saving, and it isn't coming back, because the people who carried it are gone and the worlds they'd have read are ash. We'll carry what's left. We'll teach what can be taught. But Thune is gone, and the rim cluster is gone, and we can't bring those back for you, and I won't stand in this chamber and let you believe we can." He stopped. He had said more in that chamber than I had ever heard him say, and it was still, by the measure of any speech, almost nothing, a plain accounting, flatly given, no flourish, no triumph, no demand. He had not gloated. There was not 1 ounce of gloat in the man. If anything, there was grief in him, the particular grief of a person who has watched something he loved and tended be broken by people who never understood it was alive. And then Harlan Ray's did the only hard thing he did that day. He looked at Seilasin, the old high warden who had once turned the warmth of his open frond down into the well and offered us our retirement as a gift, and he said the last of it. "You can keep your blessings," he said. "We'll keep the worlds blooming, we always were." He sat down. The fronds did not open. There was no rustle of agreement, no soft dry grass swell of pleasure around the ring. There was only the long quiet of several hundred Bloomerdens sitting in the cool shade of their high tiers, looking down at last, truly looking, I think, for the first time in 300 years, at the 6 old people in the pool of gold light at the bottom of the well, and understanding, too late for 400 worlds, What hands had been holding them up the whole time? The carriers resumed. That part is true, and I will not pretend otherwise. Humanity flew the lanes again, and the conquered, what was left of it, slowly steadied, and over the years that followed many of the dying worlds were caught and held and brought back from the edge by the old patient work returning to them. The conclave even, eventually, in a session I was not present for, voted to seat the human delegation in the tiers rather than the well. I am told Mara Quill declined the seat. I am told she said the bench in the light had always suited the carriers fine. But Thune did not come back. The rim cluster did not come back. The coastal worlds did not come back. They are dead worlds now, quiet and barren under their own untended skis, and they are dead because a body of people who blessed worlds and never carried them decided that the hands doing the carrying were a function, and that a function can be retired, and handed away their own life as a mercy to the only ones holding it. I am old now myself. I do not read for the chamber anymore. But I went back once to the vaulted bloom and stood for a while at the bottom of it, in the pool of late gold light that still falls, by the geometry of that grown glass dome, on the place where the carriers used to sit. And I thought about how the wardens had spent 3 centuries looking down into that well and seeing the bottom of something, when all along they had been looking at the root. The bloom wardens learned a great deal in the end. They learned the word the carriers used for the work. They learned what the hands had been holding. It cost 400 worlds to teach them, and they were the ones who had set the price.